Hey guys, welcome to what's probably my first really major video with you all. We're going to be looking at federalism and just how it works as a system of government. Rather than having several different videos for you all to look at, I'm trying to squeeze as much content together in one video as I can because I imagine you're more likely to watch one longer video than multiple medium length videos. Let me know what you think of that. All right, y'all can look at that on your own, but these are the major concepts, some of the big questions that we're going to be looking at. All right. The big one, something you should be familiar with, is the separation of powers. And essentially, it breaks down to our government is broken down into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Most of you should know that at this point. We're going to take a deeper look at some of this. All right. So, congressional powers. Congress can make laws. It has what's called the power of the purse. It controls the budget. And it can declare war. The executive office, or the president, enforces the laws, the ones made by Congress. It can make treaties. And this is an important one that we'll come back to later. So, the president can talk to other foreign leaders and make a treaty, but it doesn't go into effect until Congress ratifies it. And he is the commander in chief. So Congress can declare war, but the president is in charge of the military once that happens. He also has the ability to grant pardons to any criminal, anyone who's been convicted. He can say, nope, you're good. And they actually make a lot of use of that power, and it's kind of one people don't think of too often. All right, judicial branch, the Supreme Court. It interprets laws. One bullet point, so much there. It's going to be its wholly own unit. You're going to hate hearing about it at some point. All right, and essentially what that breaks down to is it can review the decisions of state governments and the federal government. It can declare executive actions of the president or laws passed by Congress and signed into law by the president void and if they're found to be unconstitutional. It is the sleeping giant of our government, and we'll take a deeper look at that definitely in the coming units. So kind of as I just talked about, we have what's called a system of checks and balances where every system of our government, every piece of it, is balanced out by the other two. Essentially, the two of the branches will never let the other branch become too powerful. If nothing else, out of their own selfish interest of holding on to power, you don't want any other branch becoming more powerful. So, breaking down some of those checks, executive checks, the president checks on Congress. He has a veto, and that's probably the one you hear about the most. All right. And for now, that's just the big one we're going to worry about. We'll look at some of the other powers that he has over them later on. All right. And his checks on the judiciary, or at least the big ones, is that he nominates the judges. So he's literally deciding who's on the court. All right. And then he can ignore a Supreme Court ruling. And while that's not necessarily constitutional, we've seen it done more than once, and it's not been called into the question. So it's assumed that the president has this power, though it is not necessarily in his best interest to use it. All right, so congressional checks. There's a lot of them. We're just going to leave me where I'm at, I guess, for now. We'll move to the other side in a second. So checks on the president, they can override his veto with a 2/3 vote of both houses. That's I want to say 357 people, 358. Yeah. All right. They can impeach the president. All right. That starts in the House of Representatives and then moves to the Senate. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the impeachment processes of Donald Trump. He was impeached by the House of Representatives, but acquitted by the Senate. So he's still in office. Congress can refuse to pass a bill that the president wants. So the president can suggest legislation, but it has to be passed by Congress. It has to be written by Congress. So they can just refuse to do what he wants. They have the ability to confirm or, I guess, really reject presidential nominees. So the president has a lot of power in who he appoints into the various offices of government, but no one gets there without being confirmed by the Senate. And so I mentioned that before, where the president can make a treaty with another nation. That's an awesome power, but once that happens, it has to be ratified by the Senate. All right. Congress also has a lot of checks. A lot of checks on the Supreme Court. The most powerful one that hasn't been used in quite a while is the ability to alter the number of judges on the court. And essentially, we have 9 justices now, but say Congress isn't happy with how the court's ruling, it can simply add more judges and then fill those spots with judges that are more sympathetic or in line with their points of view. Granted, it's the president that appoints those judges, but assuming the president and the Congress are in agreement, they can really mess with the court. On the flip side, they can also scale down the court by removing justices. They can mess with jurisdiction, and we'll look at that later, and they can change what the courts are and aren't capable of looking at. They can propose constitutional amendments to override court decisions. So say Congress passes a law and the Supreme Court says that law is unconstitutional. Congress could hypothetically propose an amendment to the Constitution to make that law constitutional. Also, they can pass legislation to limit a court's ruling. So the court may say that something is unconstitutional, but then the Congress makes a law that's within the constitutional limits, that kind of just negates a large portion of what the court had set up. We'll look at some specific examples of that later. There's not really a short way to describe that. So we talked about the president appointing, and then the Senate can confirm nominees. And the Congress also has the ability to impeach federal justices if they are found guilty of crimes, just like you can impeach a president. To my knowledge, that's never been done. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty confident that we've never had an occurrence of that up to this point. All right. Judicial checks. There are much fewer, but man, are they big. They have the ability to declare federal laws unconstitutional. I mean, that's on the same note, they do the same thing to presidents and their executive orders. And the Supreme Court doesn't have many other powers. I mean, that is the bulk of its power. That is its power. But when you really think about how big of one it is, it doesn't need other checks. All right, so this is just a nifty little chart. If you're trying to think about it, this is a great study tool. Across the top, it tells you what the powers they can do. So you have the gray zones, it's where they line up. And then going across, those are their checks on the other branch's powers. So like for Congress, in the first one, those are in the gray box, those are the things Congress can do. And then Congress is checked by the executive. You move over one, and so the executive can veto those laws, and then the judiciary can declare them unconstitutional. Just a simple chart, but a helpful one. All right, so in short, separation of powers, checks and balances, prevents any one branch from becoming too powerful. It also makes sure that there are many, many ways for us, the citizens, to influence public policy through the offices in which we can vote. All right. And the purpose of all of this is to ensure that the people's will is best represented and that freedom is preserved. It's part of that preamble that y'all probably already know. All right. So we're going to be talking a lot about the different Federalist Papers in here. And at the moment, I'm just going to bring reference to Federalist number 51, which is where the writers of the Federalist Papers break down their ideas of the separation of powers and checks and balances and how it protects the minority rights. It makes sure that somehow government is looking out for the best interest of the people by keeping all the powers separated from the other branches. With all that said, if you're curious about Federalist Paper number 51, you can't click on the link in this video, but if you go to the actual slides, you can click on this link, which is this big old picture here. And it is a video all about Federalist Paper 51, or Google it and read it. We're not going to try and read through all the Federalist Papers this year, just because of being virtual. You would definitely benefit from it. I highly recommend it, but I'm not assigning it to you. I feel like y'all have enough on your plates as it is. All right, so I know this video is getting long. If you're following along on your own slides, you're like, oh man, he skipped some slides. You all are capable of reading them and looking at those questions. I'm not going to bog you down with them. We're just going to keep moving. So we're going to look at impeachment for a minute, which is one of the major powers that Congress has as one of its checks on the other two branches. Congress can impeach the president or Supreme Court justice for what are called high crimes and misdemeanors. With the impeachment process of Donald Trump, high crimes and misdemeanors was hotly debated as what that means and whether or not the situation surrounding Trump's impeachment actually met those requirements. Time permitting, I would love to look more into that with you all. That may be one of the in-person things that we do here in the future. The House of Representatives can impeach a president through a simple majority vote. So it doesn't require a supermajority like an amendment or anything like that, or even like a presidential veto. The Senate then holds an impeachment trial. So once the president is impeached by the House, he goes to trial before the Senate, and that requires a 2/3 vote to remove the president or judge from office. That's 67 people, 67 votes. So it requires a lot of people. To date, that's never happened. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were all formally impeached by the House of Representatives. They were not indicted, or they were not convicted by the Senate, and they were not removed from office. Just for the sake of argument, Richard Nixon was not technically impeached. He resigned from office before he could officially be impeached, though we kind of count him amongst the disgraced few who have been impeached. And my slides will no longer change. There we go. We'll actually look at this later. Moving on to the next one, we're going to start looking at federalism. Sorry I'm jumping through this, but I really don't want to spend all my time, make you all spend all your time watching my videos. Federalism is the division of powers between the national, state, and local governments. We've talked about this a little bit already, but it's time to really dig in with this. We're going to be talking a lot about how the federal system of government, then the idea of federalism, has evolved over time. But the first thing we got to talk about are the delegated powers, and those are the powers directly given to the federal government. Those things are like coining money, controlling foreign trade, immigration, those things you think about. Reserve powers, those are your state powers. Those are your state rights. So they're in charge of education and welfare. They issue things like driver's license, marriage license. They make their own laws, those kind of things. Concurrent powers, and this is where things get interesting. These are the laws. These are the places where they share power. See, I can be in right in the middle there. Both groups have the ability to tax, borrow money, establish banks. Punish criminals is another one that's pretty important, and we're going to talk about a lot later. All right. So for the majority of U.S. history, from the passage of the Constitution, from its ratification to like the 1930s, with the Great Depression, we operated under this dual federalism idea, this layer cake is what a lot of people will call it, where the federal government and the state governments both work independent of the other. And there's just really no interaction between the two. The state has their powers. Oh, go backwards. Slides. Yeah. So the states have those reserve powers, and the federal government has its delegated powers, and they don't cross. There are the few concurrent powers, but that is it. All right. After the Great Depression, you're going to get a marbling effect. What's called cooperative federalism. And those lines are going to cross. Things are going to get blurry. We're going to enter into the gray area of what is and isn't federal and state powers. All right. So this cooperative federalism sees the federal government gaining a lot more power over the various state governments. And it starts doing this by offering the states money. So the federal government can't necessarily tell the states what they can and can't do, but they can say, here's a chunk of change if you do things this way. And so the federal government begins to be able to dictate policy to the states by offering money. Now, the states don't have to take said money, but they like it. Like, here, have some money for rebuilding if you do things our way. Yeah, we'll come back to that later. All right. So we talked about how the Great Depression really expanded those powers, and that's where that marbling came from, and that's a whole lot of FDR. Roosevelt inherited an economy in shambles. The Great Depression had just ruined the nation, and what he was saying was the federal government's got to take power. We got to get the 50 states working together, or I guess they weren't 50 states at that time. We got to get these states, Alaska and Hawaii are coming, but the states to work together to pull ourselves out of the mess that was the Great Depression. He's going to do that with his New Deal politics, and the power he's going to take. One of those big things he's going to do, and it's going to become a hotly debated issue, is this National Recovery Act. And part of that act is going to give the federal government the power to really stimulate the economy and take control of like wages and regulations. And it's just a dramatic increase in what the federal government can do. This thing is going to be ruled unconstitutional, even though it really was helping people, for two main reasons. Like, states were upset about this, especially like states' rights supporters, because let's see if we can change the slide. There we go. It violated the separation of powers, and it violated the 10th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that it went too far into the federal government claiming the powers that belong to the states as laid out in the Bill of Rights. So even though it was really done in the best interest, it was a violation of the Constitution according to the Supreme Court, and it would be reversed just a few years later. Now, some of you may find this interesting, looking at this going, if you're reading through this going, but the federal government does do a lot to control, like does price control and wage control, and really controls intrastate commerce. Well, yes, because they're going to figure out ways around it because the Supreme Court said they couldn't. They had to get more creative with how they went about it. Grants and aid. It's the next thing. It's like lemonade. It's grants and aid. Money. Federal dollars to the states allows the federal government to aid and influence the states. Categorical grants is something you're going to hear a bunch about. This is when the federal government gives money to a state for a specific purpose. So they're like, here's the money. If you want it, you have to use it for this one specific thing. And states are like, okay, thanks. We'll take your money. We'll do it. Whatever. Essentially, they're the strings attached. The state, like a lot of the times the federal government will say, we'll give you unrestricted money that they can use, but they have to take the strings attached money in addition to it, and they have to be within whatever regulation the federal government lays out. A good example of this was the drinking age. That's changed a lot through the years. And the federal government was the one that pushed for that 21-year-old drinking age. So if you have a problem with it, take it up with the government. Because they were kind of savage with how they went about it. A 10% cut every year in their federal highway fund, if they didn't change it, that's painful to a state economy. So the states were essentially forced into it. While they could have made the decisions to ignore this 21-year-old mandate, it definitely came at a cost. So they're like, it's not a law, but it's going to hurt not to. And it's just an example of how the federal government started to realize how it can flex its muscles over the states with the money. Another way they can do it is something definitely for the good, as American with Disabilities Act. There wasn't really funds attached to this. But essentially it mandated that for any federal building, any public building, there has to be handicap accessible ways to get about things. And this was just an example of the federal government saying, this is what you got to do. Here's the money to do it. Make it happen. It wasn't an argument. It's just designated money. And while it's a good thing, a lot of states weren't happy about it. And I want you to think about why. I don't want to answer that just right off, but I think you can think about it. We'll talk about this in class probably, and why you think states were opposed to something that seems pretty good to most people. Now, block grants, whole other ballgame. Definitely a favorite amongst the states. This is the money that is just given broadly by the federal government to the states. It doesn't have nearly as much control over the states. Um, and so they definitely prefer it. They don't like being told what to do, and they just were like, yes, money. A lot of the times this is used in like with revenue sharing. So the federal government takes taxes, and a certain percent of those taxes goes into funding education, which is also something that's funded by the states. And so now they're sharing that cost of education together. So just kind of thinking about that federal perspective on grants. It's just their way of being able to influence policy in area without actually making a law. They can essentially make laws without making a law. It stay within inside the Constitution. There's no law against them offering money, but there may be constitutional problems with them, like mandating certain rules. I just found this chart, this graph, it's like interactive, of the drinking age as it changed. And you can kind of watch and see how it changes over time. The 21-year-old drinking age, it ebbs and flows with popularity. At the moment, it's 21 everywhere you go, but it changes. And that has everything to do with federal funding and what's popular in Congress at the time. So obviously, states hold a different opinion on federal grants than the federal government does. I love this little cartoon. It's got Uncle Sam there going federal authority, and the government, the states are like, no, we don't like your authority. But in the other hand, he's coming around, he's like, federal benefits, and states are like, yes, we like this. We don't like your authority, but we want your money. Kind of like teenagers with their parents, I guess, sometimes wanting money to go do things. States don't like it because it feels like they lose power. They don't like losing their sovereignty to be in control of things. But at the same time, they need the money to do the things they need to do. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword at times. So we had that marbled system for a long time, and it kind of got, I'm going to say, out of hand. And then Ronald Reagan comes along in the 1980s, and his big thing is going to be devolution of powers. Give the powers back to the states and trying to return back to a more layered system of federalism. And we're going to call this new federalism or neo-federalism. All right. So there's some articles here, things to read. This is what we are going to be doing in class. So please take a look at these. Be ready with it. I guess that's actually not true because you don't really have time to really dig into this by Monday. So what I think we'll do is not this Monday, but next Monday, we will dig into this and we'll kind of set up there'll be a week's pause between our in-class discussions, but that way you have time to be prepared for it in class. You'll have things to look at and think about. So this next week, we'll do business as usual in class for those of you in person. Virtual, those of you who are in virtual land, we'll be making discussion posts about this. So not this Monday and Tuesday, but next Monday, Tuesday, we'll be digging into some of these three issues. Be prepared, be ready. It'll be good. Thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for hanging on. I know it was kind of long. I'll work on trying to get them shorter, guys.